Dear students, good day. Today is our lecture number 10 of Psycholinguistics. Now, this lecture I've prepared as a continuation of our previous lecture that explained. Now, I'm giving a brief encounter of how you pronounce the words, how our brain helps us. Like in psycholinguistics, it's all about a relation about the brain and how the human brain activates language and how the human uses it. So the pronunciation also is a short explanation of how we use the language or how it is produced. Now, productivity in psycholinguistics. So we'll start, I'll give you a brief outline of that and then we'll go into it further. I have some diagrams today also to explain to you. It's all related to your lecture number 9, so you can easily relate to it today. Now, if we study today productivity, this is an important characteristic of human language, allowing us to continuously create new utterances. So productivity, when we are producing or producing language, it's an important characteristic because humans always are creating new utterances or new sounds or new words. So combining the building bricks of language in ever new ways. Now, whether these be sounds, words, or sentences, human languages are therefore continually evolving. So human language is always continually evolving and changing. So almost on a daily basis you're creating new sounds, new words, maybe new sentences. People are using slang words, so that creates a new vocabulary also. So this is how human brain would comprehend language or produce language. Now, cultural transmission. This also is important because this refers to how languages are acquired by our children. We studied that in previous lectures. The assumption is that there is no genetic component, although Noam Chomsky challenges this with his theory of universal grammar. So basically what we were studying was that how the children would acquire language or get hold of language. The assumption is that there is no genetic component, like it's not genetically inherited. You cannot inherit a language or learn how to speak just without learning. So Noam Chomsky challenges this theory. He says that it's by birth gift, or every human has that gift, now which would enable a child to simply start speaking. So there isn't any sort of gift that would enable a child to start speaking immediately. They have to learn the language. Now there are different techniques of that. English, for example, at a certain age, but rather that children need to be exposed to a language and culture in order to acquire it. So according to Noam Chomsky, he would say that a child has to be exposed to a culture, or let's say a situation, in order to learn the language. So when a child is brought up, let's say, in an English-speaking family, then the child would automatically learn, because he starts with imitating his parents and then he continues on. Now, this means, for example, that a child born in Korea or Korean parents, but then adopted by French parents in France, will tend to grow up speaking French as his or her first language, and not Korean, unless the French parents make sure the child is also exposed to Korean. So now this is a very good example, even if a child is born in Korea with Korean parents. So if we say that this theory that a child, the language is sort of an inbuilt ability of humans, then if a child born in Korea, then he should be fluent in Korean. But if that child, before he starts to learn the language, is adopted by French parents and goes to live in France, then automatically, because he's growing up, he's learning the language, he would learn French. He wouldn't learn Korean. So the child, only unless if the French parents would enforce the child to learn Korean also. Otherwise, whatever atmosphere a child is growing up in, that's the language the child will acquire. Now, many animals, however, do seem to pass the ability to communicate on to their offspring genetically. Dogs will bark even if they have never heard another dog. So animals are a little different from human beings. Animals can transfer that ability genetically. A dog is destined to bark, and even if a puppy is born, it will start barking from the start. But a child born cannot start speaking from the start. So humans are different from animals in that way. Now, when we move on to duality, we would say that duality or double articulation now refers to two separate layers of language working together to provide us with a pool of sounds which we can combine to communicate with one another. So duality would be a double articulation, like I was teaching in the last lecture, that it refers to two separate layers of language. They are working at the same time, working together, and they provide us different sounds that we can combine and then make into a word or a sentence and to communicate with one another. So our articulation is the way we start to talk to each other. On the one hand, now we have a limited number of discrete sounds which in isolation have no inherent meaning. For example, B, I, or N. Now on this hand, like A is not only a sound, but A is used as a word also. A flower, a book, okay, a person. But B, I, or N, these three cannot be used individually. So they have an isolation and they don't have any inherent meaning. Now on the other hand, we have a virtually unlimited number of distinct meanings which we can create by combining these sounds in certain ways. So for example, bin or nib. Now various other combinations such as B and I are not meaningful in English, but could easily possibly be in another language. So maybe in another language they have a sense, but in English, bin or nib, these three words combined do make a sound, and they are considered a word. Bin like a dustbin, or a nib like a nib of a pen. But B and I, put in that order, it's meaningless. It doesn't have any meaning in English. Now, other features of human language. A further feature of human language is reflexiveness. Now, which means that we are able to use the language to talk about language, which is typically what linguists do. Now, discreteness is also something that is said to distinguish human language from other forms of animal communication. So, other features of human language would be that a further feature is language is reflexiveness, which means that we are able to use the language by reflexes, like constantly. If we are talking about something, if we see something, we can immediately reflect and find a name for an object, or reply to, let's say, for example, somebody asks you, how are you? So you reflexively answer, I'm doing fine, or I'm bad, or I'm great. Like these things, they come suddenly. You don't have to think about those answers. So this is which typically what linguists do. So they would judge that. Now, discreteness is also something that is said to distinguish human language from other forms of animal communication. It means that the sounds of a language differ sufficiently from one another for a native speaker to distinguish them and thereby know which sign with which meaning is being used at any one time. So, discreteness would be something कि आपके जो sounds हैं जो आपके different हैं alphabets में, like for example in English and in Urdu, you have specific sounds for each alphabet. So when you're speaking in your native language, at that point that is when you can easily differ the sounds. You can distinguish the difference between the sounds, because if you're a native speaker of that language, you can easily find the difference, and then you'll know at what point what is the meaning of such and such a word, and how to use it at a particular place. Now, we'll go back now into language and the brain. Now, the connection between language and the brain. Now, language is a cognitive skill, and one, therefore, whose roots are situated in the evolution of the brain. So it's a cognitive skill. We've cleared that already. And one, therefore, which roots are situated in an evolution of the brain. The roots of the language they start from the brain. Now, we do not know exactly when our ancestors began to speak, so we have no idea when language exactly started. Let's go back to the old times, or the cave years. Maybe at that time they had a different form of language. They were using sign language, they were using drawings instead of written language. But we don't know when did they start to speak. When did they start uttering the sounds and then understanding now? Now, estimates vary from 30,000 to 100,000 years ago. So it could be like, we have no idea, it could be like 30,000 years ago, it could be 100 years ago. We don't know when the language exactly was started to spoken, or even what triggered them to do so. But once they started, there was no stopping them. So even we didn't have any idea what triggered them, how it started, or what influenced them to start speaking. But once they started speaking, there was no way of stopping them. So from such humble beginnings, the 5,000, 6,000 languages we assume to exist today are evolved. So up till now, because of that, the beginning was so humble, so let's say simple, that now we have 5,000 to 6,000 different languages that are spoken in the human community. And it exists today. We assume that they are evolved. Now, research mainly on language aphasia has been able to show that there are two major areas of the brain specialized in language processing. Now, production and comprehension. Broca's and Wernicke's areas situated in the left hemisphere and named after the two physicians who first discovered them in the 19th century. So mainly we were talking about in a previous lecture about deficiency of language, or how people cannot understand the language with brain disease. So aphasia was one of those brain diseases. Now, research mainly on language aphasia has been able to show that there are two major areas of the brain, two sides of the brain, like I told you before, the front and the back of the brain, which are specialized in language processing. So one is Broca, you can see in the diagram, and one is Wernicke. Now, Broca is in the front side of the brain, and Wernicke is at the back side of the brain. Now, these two play a major role in the connection between language process and the brain. So, situated in the left hemisphere and named after two physicians. So, Broca and Wernicke were two physicians, and these two areas were named after them, and they are the people who first discovered it in the 19th century. They were the people who discovered these two parts to be sensitive in language. So let's backtrack a little bit. Let's go back to the starting now and think about, because before we start understanding how the brain processes language, we found out, okay, there are two areas, the front and the back. There are two specific areas that target the language. But let's backtrack and let's go a little bit to the question that what is linguistics basically? Now, if you're studying psycholinguistics, that is the study of language with the brain. So linguistics has many forms. We are going to be studying in our lectures about psycholinguistics, and then after that we're going to further study social linguistics. So linguistics is the science of language. Basically, why linguistics? What is linguistics? Why do we use that word? Linguistics is the science of language. How scientifically the language is created. Now, it is generally a descriptive discipline rather than a perceptive one, which means that linguists do not lay down hard and fast rules about how to use a certain language, but rather concentrate on describing the rules. So they don't lay down rules like in the grammar rule and say that these are the rules and this is what you have to follow, but rather they concentrate on describing the rules. So they describe or explain the rules better. Especially native speakers seem to have internalized, so especially native speakers. Apart from this, there are various different ways of doing linguistics. So there is a huge different way of learning linguistics also. For example, we can concentrate on language as used at a certain point of time. For example, in 1989, this is called synchronic linguistics. So when we would take language as, or concentrate on language at a particular certain point of time, we would say, let's say that we've chosen 1989 as the year that we want to see how much a language had developed by that year or in that year. That would be called synchronic linguistics. Now, alternately, we can look at language from a diachronic point of view, which involves analyzing the development of language during a certain period of time, for example, during Middle English or in the 1950s. So the other way of looking at language would be the diachronic way. And that would explain how language changed or developed during a certain period of time. Like, let's say from one point to another point. Let's say from Middle English going up to the 1950s. How did language develop and change by that time? Now, linguistics is a science which can either be studied in a theoretical or a more applied way. There are two ways of studying it. We can either study it by theory or by applying it. Now, for example, someone may be interested in finding out exactly how questions are formed in English, or which are equal to theoretical. So, how questions are formed, यानी English में हम questions बनाते कैसे हैं, वो theory होगी, ठीक है, theoretical way होगा. Applied way जो है, once this is known, the knowledge could be applied. एक दफ़ा आप knowledge gain कर लो, उसके बाद आप वो knowledge apply करते हो. And that would be how you apply language. For example, to language teaching, thereby hopefully enabling teachers and pupils to learn the language more effectively. So, theoretical way would be finding out the questions that how do you form questions in English, and the applied way would be, in linguistics would be, how you apply that to teaching or learning a language. So for teachers and students alike. Now, we come back once again. That was just a brief history for you, are acquainted with what we are studying and to keep you up to date with all the disciplines. Now, when we were studying in the previous lecture, in lecture number 9, we were talking about the way the sounds are produced. So it's not all about just how our vocal cords would transmit the sounds, but also how our brain transmits those, understands them, and then the sounds are developed. So phonetics and phonology are two major fields, the two primary linguistic disciplines concerned with speech sounds. Now, those sounds that are used by humans to communicate are phonetics and phonology. So for humans, there are two ways, two primary linguistic disciplines, which are under psycholinguistics also. Now, we're briefly studying this so you can understand the connection between producing sounds and how the brain would perceive it. So phonetics and phonology, now both areas are mutually dependent. They're both dependent on each other. Phonetics describes the concrete physical form of sounds, how they are produced, heard, and how they can be described. So what does phonetics do? Phonetics would help you more concrete. They would help you how the sounds are produced, how you form the sounds, how you hear the sounds, and how you can describe the sounds. While phonology is concerned with the fraction of sounds, that is, with their status and inventory in the given language. Now, phones and phonetics. The two basic tasks of phonetics are the transcription and the classification of sounds. And they're also called phones in this context. So the phone is therefore the basic. Now don't confuse it with your telephone. This is not the short form of that. This we're talking about are the sound production. So the phone is therefore the basic unit of phonetics, and it refers to the concrete sound substance as such. Now in the area of articulatory phonetics, this substance is described on the basis of the articulatory properties. So in that area where we are describing sounds or differentiating sounds, this would be described on the basis of the articulatory properties. Now these refer to the human vocal tract. Like I was telling you, how you create sound, how do you create it in your lungs and then bring the air and the air pressure comes out, and how you transfer it from your vocal tract to make it into speech organs. Now illustrated below on the next slide, and are used to describe and classify sounds, to make a difference between what sound sounds like what. Now by contrast, acoustic and auditory phonetics deal with the characteristics of sound waves and how they are perceived by the human ear. Now this is diagram. I want you to study this very carefully. This will explain how the sound is produced. We have the nasal cavity, we have the alveolar ridge, the upper gums. Now because of these terms, I've used them before in a previous lecture also, and once again I'm going to be describing them. So you need to study this very clearly so you are clear about what do we mean. So the teeth, the lips, the lower jaw, the hyoid, the thyroid cartilage, the esophagus. You can see that also at the below. Then the larynx, we're going from bottom to top. The larynx, now the larynx is where the sound is produced, or how we can close the larynx and completely change the sound. Vocal cords, glottis, epiglottis, then pharynx, then tongue, then tonsils, then uvula, soft palate velum, and then the palate. So sometimes I would explain that you have to touch your tongue to the palate of your mouth to change a different sound. Now this is a very important thing. So phones are represented by placing brackets around the transcriptions. So what we do is, how we describe phones is by putting brackets around the description. For dance, in British and American English, this would be how in phonetics you would write dance, giving them a different signals. This is a completely different way of how to write the language. Now the usefulness of a transcription system, a phonetic alphabet, is particularly plausible in a language such as English. So phonetic, if you want to go with the phonetic alphabet, then it is particularly plausible in a language, especially in English, where pronunciation and spelling often diverge substantially. Now you can see C on the one hand and through and though on the other. So C, you can see the SEE, C, it has the same sounds, but it means a completely different thing. It means an ocean. On the one hand would be that, and through and though. Now through something or though on the other hand. So you can see a difference between it. You see, there is a slight difference in pronunciation. In the first word, same sound, same way those words are produced, C, but they are two different things. One is looking, one is an ocean. Through and though, Through means going through something. Though would be that maybe. Now, there are various transcription models, such as the IPA, International Phonetic Alphabet. For the transcription of English, several slightly differing systems have evolved, all of them following in some way the original model of the phonetician Daniel Jones. So phonetics is a completely different field. We're not going to study it in too much detail. What I wanted to do today is just give you an explanation of how this relates to psycholinguistics and how we would differentiate from the language, the sounds also, and how the brain recognizes it. So there is an international phonetic alphabet also, which is called the IPA. Okay, when we move on next, we would be studying classifications of sound. Now, traditionally, sounds are classified into consonants and vowels. Traditionally, if you see, they're divided into two things, consonants and vowels. So consonants are sounds that are produced with a major obstruction in the mouth cavity. So we make an obstruction in the mouth cavity to produce the consonant sounds. For example, in the case of T, there is direct contact between the tip of the tongue, the active articulator, and the alveolar ridge, the passive articulator, because we touch the top of the ridge, outer edge of that, which is called the alveolar ridge. So that the airflow coming from the lungs can leave the mouth cavity only when the obstruction is removed. This is how you can see in the diagram that it shows how the air coming from the mouth, it is the air pressure is coming in, and then how the tongue would touch the outer palate. Now, in the mouth structure right below the nose, if you see inside the lips and the teeth, the top palate, that would be the alveolar sounds. That's where your tongue will touch to make that sound of T. So you can see that up above in the picture. Now, these diagrams are supposed to make it a little easier for you to understand what we studied in lecture number 9. So, consonants would be that where we restrict the air pressure. Vowels are sounds that are produced without any obstruction. There is no obstruction. For example, in the case of I, we don't have to touch the tongue anywhere to make that sound. There is a gap within the mouth that is determined by the position of the tongue, and the airflow can escape relatively freely. I. So this would be, once again, you can see, in this there is no obstruction. The airflow comes from below and then it moves out of the mouth completely freely, and we can make that sound. Now, another difference between consonants and vowels is that vowels are generally voiced. For example, the vocal cords are set vibrating by the outgoing airflow. Consonants, by contrast, can be voiced or voiceless. So, vowels are generally or always voiced. They always have produce sound, while consonants, by contrast, can be voiced or voiceless without sound. The vocal cords are either far apart and do not vibrate, as in fan, or they are relatively closed and vibrate, as in van. So we either keep the airflow is very clear and we say fan, very easy, or we have to pronounce it by and relatively is closed and we are vibrating the airflow, outgoing airflow, as in van. When we say van, we vibrate. Now, this is voiceless and voiced sounds. You can see the difference. Now, in the upper picture, in the corner, if you look at that picture, it shows the larynx. That's what I was saying, that we can control the air pressure through that larynx. The smaller picture up above is the larynx, showing the larynx marked. And that's where we control or restrict the flow of air coming out of our lungs to produce different sounds. Now, classifications of consonants. Now, factors relevant for the classification of consonants include the manner of articulation, the place of articulation, and voicing. So with regard to the manner of articulation, English consonants can be classified into plosives, fricatives, affricates, nasals, liquids, and semivowels. Now, plosives are consonants that are made by the completely blocking the airflow. When we constrict the larynx, we completely block the airflow, and that's how plosives are made. And plosives are used in making consonant sounds. The production of plosives involves 3 stages. Now, how we produce consonants and how plosives are used is divided, the production is divided into 3 things. A direct contact between the active and the passive articulator, forming a complete obstruction to the airflow. That would be one. The second would be the compression of air behind the obstruction, how much air is being compressed behind that obstruction. And third would be and the release of the compressed air in the form of an explosion, hence the term plosive. And that's why we call it plosive, because it's like you're restricting the air, active and passive articulators, forming a complete obstruction to the airflow. So what we do is we form a sort of a blockage. So I'll join back from there. So the production of explosives now involves 3 stages. So why are we calling it plosive? We're calling it plosive because of the word explosion. Explosion would be like how, with what pressure we release the air from our lungs. So obstruction, when we are completely obstructing the airflow from our lungs coming out of the air tract. When we make an obstruction, when we put some sort of restriction in it, then the compression of the air behind, how much air we are compressing behind that air obstruction, and then the release of the compressed air suddenly when we release it, it's like an explosion. And that's why we call it plosive. Now, there are 6 plosives in English. Bilabial, which would be P and B. Alveolar, which would be T and D. And velar, which would be K and G. We have studied these in the starting in one of our lectures, so you can refer back to those lectures to make sure what these things are. But I'll further go on explaining it to you that bilabial plosives P and B are produced with both lips pressed together. Now the active articulator is the lower lip. The lower lip is the active articulator. The passive articulator is the upper lip. So in bilabial plosives, when we say P or B, the lower lip is the passive and the active articulator, and upper lip would be the passive. Now the soft palate is raised and the air coming into the mouth stops for some time and then breaks the obstruction with a slight explosion. So the soft palate is raised and the air coming from our lungs into the mouth stops for some time, we stop it, and then it breaks the obstruction with a slight explosion. Now in case of B, the vocal cords are vibrating. So this would be a very good example of that. You can see in the picture how the airflow. Now the red would distinguish the pressure of the air coming out of the mouth. So you can see how it comes ahead, and when it reaches the mouth, it is blocked where you see the lighter color, lighter shade. That means that the airflow is sort of blocked and then suddenly is released. Now, alveolar plosives, T and D, are produced with the tip of the tongue. Tip means the edge of the tongue, firmly pressed against the middle part of the alveolar ridge. Now, the active articulator is the tip of the tongue. The passive articulator is the alveolar ridge. Now, the tip of the tongue makes firm contact with the 8 alveolar ridge. So, the active articulator is the tip of the tongue in this. The passive articulator is the alveolar ridge, you can see in the diagram in the previous thing. And the tip of the tongue, which makes contact with the alveolar ridge, that would be what is the firm contact. The air is trapped for a short time and then breaks the obstruction with a slight explosion. Now, in case of D, the vocal cords are vibrating also. You can see this in alveolar explosives, T and D, how the vocal cords are. They obstructed. You can see how they've closed the air coming out of the lungs, and then suddenly in the alveolar, in the palate touching it, soft palate, then when you raise it, the air comes out in an explosive way. Now, velar plosives, K and G, are articulated with the back of the tongue against the soft palate. So it's the back of the tongue touching the soft palate, the top, तालू जिसको बोलते हैं, ज़ुबान का तालू को टच करना, K, G, but front को नहीं, back वाले हिस्से को. The active articulator is the back of the tongue. Back of the tongue आपका टच करता, not tip of the tongue आप टच नहीं करते, but ज़ुबान का पिछला हिस्सा. The passive articulator is the soft palate. आपका back of the tongue जो है वो आपके तालू के पिछले वाले हिस्से को टच करेगा ये साउंड्स बनाने के लिए. K, G. So the back of the tongue makes firm contact with the soft palate. The air is trapped for a short time and then breaks the obstruction with a slight explosion. In case of G, the vocal cords are vibrating. Once again, you can see velar explosives, K and G, how the diagram explains very clearly how the tongue is, the back of the tongue is touching the upper palate, soft upper palate. Okay, now fricatives. Fricatives are consonants that are produced by impeding but not completely blocking the airflow. So, fricatives would be consonants, they're produced by impeding, but they're not completely blocking the airway. वो block नहीं करता completely. That is that there is a narrow gap between the active and the passive articulator along which the airflow can leave the oral cavity. Now, there are 9 fricatives in English: labio-dental, F and V, interdental, which you can see those signs for, alveolar, S and Z, palate-alveolar, once again you can see a small Z, and glottal, H. This is the labio-dental fricatives, how the air pressure comes out of the lungs and how we produce the sound. Now, the lower lip is very close to the edge of the upper front teeth. आपका lower lip जो है वो आपके upper front teeth के बड़े नज़दीक बनेगा, thus forming an incomplete obstruction. हम lower lip को जब touch करते हैं upper teeth के साथ वो obstruction create करता है, लेकिन बहुत मामूली, very small amount. Now, when the air goes through the narrowing, it causes slight friction. Hence the term fricative. So now, इसलिए हम उसको fricative बोलेंगे. For F, the vocal cords do not vibrate. There may be some vibration accompanying V when it occurs in word initial positions, as in e.g., vast, or between vowels, as in, for example, never. So interdental fricatives would make this sound according, you can see the difference in the diagrams, explaining to you how it looks, the differences. So what I would like you students to do is study these diagrams in detail. so that you can realize how the airflow is producing the sounds. Now, all of these sounds, why this is connected to psycholinguistics is because all of these sounds that we create and how, first of all, we wanted to learn how these sounds are created. So once they're created, then we see the relation between the brain of how the brain works to differentiate the sounds. So the tip of the tongue is either close to the edge of the upper teeth or slightly projected between the teeth. Now for the friction is as strong as for F, and for the other sign it is gentler. Now for the vocal cords that they don't vibrate, they vibrate for this sign when it occurs in word initial position, before a vowel or in an intervolate position. For example, that, rather, etc. So that would be the TH sound. Now other fricatives are produced with different places of articulation. For the alveolar fricatives S and Z, the tip of the tongue is close to the alveolar ridge. The teeth are very close together. The friction for is strong, even stronger than for that sound. For S, the vocal cords do not vibrate. They vibrate for Z. When it occurs before vowels or in intervocalic positions, for example, zone or easy. Now alveolar and palate-alveolar fricatives, you can see how the sounds are produced, S and Z, and how the air manages to flow path. Now for the tip of the tongue is close to the back part of the alveolar ridge, forming a flat narrowing. Now the front part of the tongue is raised towards the hard palate, forming the front secondary focus. The friction for F is strong, stronger than for F and the other signal. Now the vocal cords do not vibrate. They vibrate for that word Z when it occurs before vowels. For example, pleasure. So at that point, then it does vibrate, because when you're saying ja, when you're giving the sound of ja, pleasure. Now it's written as S-U-R, so it should be pleasure. But when you speak or pronounce it, at that point, S-U would give the sound of ja. So it would be, the word would be pleasure, ja, instead of sure. It is produced with the voiceless expulsion of air from the lungs, with the mouth and tongue already in position of the following vowel. Glottal fricative, you can see how the air passes through and how it's produced. Now affricates are sounds that are similar to both plosives and fricatives. The tip of the tongue touches the back part of the teeth ridge. The front part of the tongue is raised towards the hard palate. So in this, that the tip of the tongue would touch the back part of the teeth ridge. आपके दांत के back वाले हिस्से पे आपका वो tip of the tongue touch करेगा. The front part of the tongue is raised towards the hard palate. Front आपका तालू पे वो touch करेगा उसको. Now the air is trapped for a short time because of the complete obstruction between the tip of the tongue and the teeth ridge. Then the obstruction is released slowly and the friction is heard. The voiceless affricate is T as in chain, whereas D and Z as in jelly. अब D and Z का combination jelly तो नहीं हम बोलेंगे ना उसको. So we'll say J is voiced. Now nasals are consonants which, like plosives, are produced by completely blocking the airstream, but there is an important difference. जो nasal से आप आवाज आपके आती है, ठीक है, वो उसी तरह है plosives की तरह, but it's produced by completely blocking the airstream को block करके, but there is an important difference. फर्क है. The airflow escapes through the nasal cavity, hence the term nasals. So instead of the airflow coming out of your mouth, it's coming through the nose. And the air is escaping from there, and that's why it sounds, the sounds would be nasal. There are 3 nasal consonants in English, 3 main nasal consonants. Bilabial is M, the alveolar would be N, and velar would be an N also. Now bilabial nasal, M, you see how it's coming out of the tract, like there is the vocal tract going and then there is the nasal tract on top. So out of the vocal thing, the air pressure is going up and then releasing from the nasal. That is creating the bilabial nasal M. The lips are firmly kept together, forming the complete obstruction. And our active articulator is the lower lip. The passive articulator is the upper lip. The soft palate is lowered and air escapes through the nasal cavity. The vocal cords are vibrating. So the lips in this are kept firmly together by forming a complete obstruction. So आपके होंठ जुड़े हुए रहते हैं ताकि वो obstruction आपकी complete हो और आपकी आवाज़ हवा जो है वो आवाज़ की सूरत में escape ना हो. The active articulator जो होगा is the lower lip. Lower lip आपका active articulator होगा. The passive articulator is the upper lip. So passive आपका upper lip होगा. The soft palate is lowered and the air escapes through the nasal cavity. So soft palate आपका जो है वो lowered हो जाएगा और air जो है आपकी escape करके nasal cavity से escape करेगी. Now the vocal cords are vibrating. So alveolar nasal, you can see how they're escaping. Like we close the lips, we close the palate and make the sound come out of the nasal passage. Now the tip of the tongue is pressed against the alveolar ridge, forming the complete obstruction. The active articulator is the tip of the tongue and the passive articulator is the alveolar ridge. The soft palate is lowered and the air escapes through the nasal cavity. The vocal cords are vibrating. So the tip of the tongue, आपकी tongue की tip जो है, is pressed against the alveolar ridge, forming the complete obstruction. यानी उसको tip of the tongue को आपने alveolar ridge के साथ touch किया, जो एक obstruction create कर देता है, ताकि air आपके वो pass होके बाहर ना आए. The active articulator is the tip of the tongue. अब active इसमें जो part play कर रहा है वो आपका tip of the tongue है जो, and the passive articulator would be the alveolar ridge. Alveolar passive का मतलब ये इसलिए कि वो उसका कोई action नहीं हो रहा उसमें. It is playing a part, but it is inactively playing a part. तो active इसमें जो होगा वो आपका tip of the tongue होगा, क्योंकि आपका tip of the tongue नीचे से ऊपर जाके उसको alveolar ridge को touch करता है. Alveolar ridge is not going to have any movement. It's the tip of the tongue moving there. So the soft palate is lowered and the air escapes through the nasal cavity. So soft palate थोड़ा सा lowered हो जाता है back पे and आपका जो air है वो जो है वो escape करता है nasal cavity से. So vocal cords are vibrating and create a nasal sound. You can see in the diagram that in the velar nasal, it shows how the air is escaping the nasal gland. Now the back of the tongue is pressed to the soft palate, forming the complete obstruction. So back of the tongue जो है वो press हो रहा है soft palate को, forming the complete obstruction. आपका complete obstruction को जो है form कर रहा है वो. Now the active articulator is the back of the tongue. Active part कौन सा? Back of the tongue. And the passive articulator is the soft palate. So passive जो इसकी कोई action नहीं है is the soft palate. The soft palate is lowered and the air escapes through the nasal cavity. The vocal cords are vibrating. Now liquids include alveolar I and post-alveolar R. This would be the way you can see how in the diagram both of the paths are joining and then how the sound escapes. The tip of the tongue is in firm contact with the alveolar ridge, forming the complete obstruction. Now the active articulator is the tip of the tongue. So active आपका जो है वो होगा articulator, वो होगा tip of the tongue होगा, ठीक है. And the passive articulator is the alveolar ridge. Now the sides of the tongue are lowered and the air can pass between them. So जुबान का जो sides हैं उसको lower up करते हैं and sort of makes a circle, bringing your tongue in the shape, and then the air can pass between them. The vocal cords are brought together and are vibrating. Now post-alveolar, R, that's the sound, R. You can see how what difference you can make, and how when you pronounce these words, students, what I want you to do is learning to pronounce the words so that you can tell the difference of how each alphabet sounds and how you yourself are touching the tip of the tongue to the different parts of the mouth to create these sounds. That's how you're going to understand. Just by reading this, it's not easy to understand it. Keep the diagrams in mind, try to understand the text, and try to experiment it on yourself. By experimenting, slowly, go slow, don't do it fast. Take your time. R. When you're saying that word, now you are going to realize how your tongue is turning or where the tip of the tongue is touching, and then you can better understand these things by experimentation. Now the tip of the tongue is held in a position near to but not touching the back part of the alveolar ridge. So एक point आ गया कि tip of the tongue को हम एक position में hold करते हैं which is not touching the alveolar ridge. The soft palate is raised and the air flows quietly between the tip of the tongue and the hard palate. So soft palate जो है वो हम raise करते हैं and the air flows quietly. Air का जो flow है वो quietly comes between the tip of the tongue और जो hard palate है उसके बीच में से. Now the front part of the tongue is low and the back is rather high. Front part of the tongue वो थोड़ा सा low हो जाएगा और back उसका जो है वो rather high होगा, so that the tongue has a curved shape, ताकि आपका tongue जो है उसका curved shape बन जाए. The vocal cords are vibrating. So once we keep on going ahead, then we see that the semi-glides or glides include bilabial W and palatal J. W as in Y starts out with the lips firmly rounded, Y. So we sort of make a circle of the lips to pronounce that word. These articulators then moving away, gliding from the narrowing in the mouth. So gliding ko hum narrowing of the mouth आप feel करोगे. When articulating J as in U instead of you, like you could say, so आप J का sound दे रहे हो ना, U. The first front part of the tongue is first raised towards the hard palate. So front part of the tongue को आप जो है ना hard palate की तरफ raise करते उठाते हैं, then the soft palate is raised, फिर soft palate को raise किया जाता है and the air goes along the central part of the tongue, और central part tongue के बीच में central part से गुजर के air जाती है. The vocal cords are kept together and are vibrating. Vocal cords दोनों इकट्ठी रहेंगे और vibrate करेंगे. Now the reason why these sounds are called semi-vowels is thus their manner of articulation. Thus true vowels, semi-vowels are produced without a major obstruction. For example, there is a wide gap between the active and the passive articulator, so that the airflow can escape relatively freely from the mouth. However, unlike true vowels, semi-vowels never form the nucleus of a syllable. यानी उसका center नहीं बनेगा, nucleus नहीं बनेगा उसका. Let's say like weak, yellow, and are therefore usually considered consonants. इसलिए उनको हम consonants कहेंगे, क्योंकि वो center में कभी बहुत कम use होते हैं. So when we come to the classification of vowels, now depending on the height of the tongue, vowels can be classified into high, low, and mid vowels. Number one, when the front of the or the back of the tongue is raised towards the roof of the mouth, the vowel is called high. This is the case, for example, in pill, meet, look, or soon. When the front of the back of the tongue is as low as possible, the vowel is called low, as, for example, in land, star, dog. So, pill, meet, look, soon. Land, star, dog. Now, when the tongue occupies the position intermediate between the high and the low one, the vowel is called mid. So there are three types of vowels: the high, the low, and the mid. High हुआ कब in case में जब आपने pill किया, जब I पे ज़्यादा जोर है, meet, E पे जोर है, look, oh पे आप जोर दे रहे हो, soon जब आपने उस पे ज़्यादा वो प्रेशर दिया. Low कब आया? Land. इसमें बहुत short उसकी pronunciation. Star, dog. Now mid में would be that it would be when the tongue occupies the position intermediate between the high and the low one. That would be called the mid. Like, for example, in get, or the unstressed E in about. About. So उस पे stress नहीं डाला जाता. Now, depending on the part of the tongue that is raised, most vowels are classified into front, back, and central vowels. When the front part of the tongue is raised towards the hard palate, the vowel is called front. For example, in meet, get, or land. When the back part of the tongue is raised towards the soft palate, the vowel is called back, as in star, dog, law, or soon. Now, when the front part of the tongue is raised towards the back part of the hard palate, the voice is called central, for example, in about, much, or nurse. Now, these high, low, and front back dimensions of vowel articulation are also referred to as vowel quality. Now, to illustrate how the articulatory properties of vowels relate to each other, a vowel chart is commonly used as a reference system. The chart below, अब ये चीज़ देखने के लिए कि articulatory properties vowels की कैसे relate करती हैं एक दूसरे के साथ, तो एक chart use किया जाता है reference system के लिए. The chart below, which I am going to show on the next slide, adapted from Courtman 2006-68, describes the basic vowel qualities of most standard varieties of English together with their phonetic transcriptions. So as can be seen from this chart, some vowels do not only differ qualitatively but also quantitatively, as indicated by the colon as the diacritic for length. Now, long as opposed to short vowels also differ by being tense as opposed to lax. Now, this is the chart. You can see how it's pronounced and how the vowels go from one to another, making sounds: meet, pit, met, cat, bird, about, dumb, bar, pod, boots, book, sword. So this is the difference. You can see आपका sound के variations. Tense vowels are produced with a deliberate, accurate, maximally distinct gesture that involves considerable muscular effort. So tense vowels क्या हुए कि वो आपके production जो है they are produced deliberate, यानी जानबूझ के on accurate, maximally distinct gesture that involves considerable muscle effort. आपकी muscular effort बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरी होती है tense vowels की sounds देने में. Now, tense vowels are either long vowels, जिनको खींच के लंबा बोला जाता है, for example, I, ठीक है, I, that is a tense vowel. Or let's say like in meet, or diathongs, EL, in say. Now, non-tense or lax vowels are produced rapidly and are therefore short. L, like in pill, बहुत short sound उसकी जो है ना end होती है. Diathongs. Now, what are diathongs? We've given a brief explanation for that. The vowels described so far have been monophthongs in contrast to the diphthongs or gliding vowels. Now where the tongue moves from one position to another, gliding कि वो slightly glide कर रहा है, move कर रहा है. Examples can be found in day, fight, oil, so, and now for the so-called closing diphthongs. While centering diphthongs occur, for example, in bear, beer, and shore. So phonemes and phonology. Phonemes, in contrast to phones, are defined by their function within the language system, language. Now this function is basically one of meaning differentiation, although other functions of phonic mean such as an expressive function of vowel lengthening, that was cool, are also possible. All sounds, however, which have a meaning differentiating function within a given language are considered phonemes within that language system. Now these are abstract, idealized units within our minds or parts of our model of a language that we design. In language use, parole phonemes are always realized as phones. The test for these smallest distinctive units of a given language system is the minimal pair test. For example, when difference in sound structure also causes a shift in meaning, an example is K in cable and T in table, which therefore constitute phonemes of English, now indicated by the notation K and T. Note, however, that we are dealing with the actual sound structure here, not with the spelling. So T, he are a minimal pair, while CC are not. So CC wouldn't be a minimal pair, but T, he, wo minimal pair hoga. Kyun? Because they are a little different. T, he. They do rhyme, but they have a little difference. But CC, both C's, they wouldn't be a minimal pair. So also minimal pairs are only pairing that differ in exactly one segment. So pin, tin, or tin and ten are minimal pairs, while pin and ten would not be. So allophones, then if we go into allophones, some sounds differences do not differentiate meaning. As in the pronunciation of L in the word lip and pill. While the difference may be only slight, you may try to keep track of where you place the tip of your tongue from a phonetic point of view. The two realizations of L have to be considered two phones, but not two phonemes. Two phones unko consider karenge, but two phonemes nahi. They are called clear and dark, and are two allophones of the phoneme L in English. Now, distribution of allophones. In contrast to phonemes, allophones do not occur in minimal pairs, which means they either never occur in the same environment, complementary distribution, as in the case of clear and dark, or they occur in free variation. So, for example, voiceless plosives at the end of a syllable or word are sometimes aspirated. If deep is pronounced defe, but they may just as well not be. If deep is pronounced dip, it would change. So the decisive difference between phonemes and their allophones is that the variants of a phoneme do not differentiate meaning, and therefore the sound's difference does not constitute a relevant phonetic feature. Now, phonological systems. The phonology of a language is also the inventory of its phonemes. For example, the sum of those sounds that show distinctive, for example, meaning differentiating phonetic differences. RP, as the standard British English sound system, for example, has 24 consonants, 16 to 12 vowels, and 8 diphthongs. But it has many more allophones, such as clear and dark, L, or the aspirative plosives. So by contrast, this table shows the phoneme inventory of standard Mandarin, the official language of China, as can be seen One major difference in English is that standard Mandarin lacks the voiced bilabial, alveolar and velar plosives like B, D and G, while Mandarin is the Chinese language, while it has the aspirated versions of the consonants P, T and K as distinct phonemes. So in other words, a difference aspiration that does not distinguish meaning in English and is thus a redundant articulatory feature constitutes a distinctive feature in the Mandarin Chinese, while another one, the voice of explosives, is distinctive in English. That is, it distinguishes meaning, but not in Chinese. So syllables would be phonology does not only describe a system of sounds in isolation, but it also deals with the rules and restrictions that hold for their combination. This branch of phonology is called phonotactics. Phones combine into the syllable, which is essentially a vowel with optional consonants clustered around it. So the vowel forms the nucleus of a syllable, with the onset in front of it and the coda behind it. Depending on whether there is a coda or not, a syllable can be described as either closed or open. The basic form of English syllable is CCC, V, CCCC. For example, I spray, or text are all examples of one syllable but of different complexity. So parasody belongs to the domain of suprasegmental phonology, in that it describes phenomena extending over more than one phoneme. The phenomena that belongs here are stress, rhythm and intonation. While stress can be word or sentence stress, rhythm and intonation occur in phrases and sentences. Now, intonation is described by reference to pitch, tones. Different levels of pitch are used to express a wide range of meaning. For example, we use the difference between a falling and a raising pitch pattern in such statements and questions. So connected speech, the phonological changes that occur when language is used in natural utterances are described as features of a connected speech. The most important ones are assimilation, that is, when neighboring sounds become more alike, as in impossible in contrast to indecent elision. That is the sound of the loss of sounds, as in Christmas or sandwich, intrusion and linking as in law और order. तो इसमें जो आपका साउंड्स का आप जो साइलेंट साउंड्स हो जाती हैं, ये उसके बारे में डिस्कस कर रहा था. कुछ वर्ड्स ऐसे होते हैं ना, किसी एक क्रिसमस में टी जो है वो साइलेंट हो जाता है, क्रिस्टमस नहीं होता, क्रिसमस लिखा जाता है, बोला नहीं जाता. So the most important feature of connected speech, however, is the occurrence of weak forms, which is the result of the occurrence of stress in connected speech. English has the property of being a stress-timed language, which means there is a tendency for stress labels to occur at fairly equal intervals. As a result, in unstressed labels, vowel quality tends to be weakened, mostly to the skava, but the total omission of vowels, as is it frequently happens in contractions such as isn't, she's, is also plausible, particularly in the case of the function words, auxiliaries, pronouns, prepositions and conjunctions. So such wouldn't be possible, like as a result it is unstressed labels, vowel qualities tend to be weakened, so vowel qualities ko thoda sa wo weak ho jate hain, mostly to skava, but the total omission of vowels, yani totally agar hum remove kar dein vowels ko, as it frequently happens in contractions such as isn't, she's, इसमें हम vowels को remove कर रहे हैं ना, short करने के लिए abbreviations लगा के, is also possible. So particularly in the case of function words, auxiliaries, pronouns, prepositions में, conjunctions में, ये possible हो सकता. So students, this was a briefing of how language results and how the sounds are produced and how we make it. This is a further very detailed study which we are not going to go into. What my reason for explaining this to you was so you can understand the production of how the sounds are produced, for you can then later on understand how the brain interprets them and then translates it. How do we form words? How do we create different sounds to form a difference in making words? And then how the brain would process that and create it into or change it into language. So basically it's all connected to psycholinguistics, how the mind works in understanding how these forms of speech are made. So in the next lecture, this is about it. In describing these, I think it's quite clear to you. What I would like you to do is now to practice these sounds. Like I said, look at the diagrams and practice the sounds so that you can know exactly how you're producing those sounds. And that's when you're making those sounds, your brain is going to connect you and tell you, okay, this is what I did. That is how the brain is connected to language. And that would be a part of psycholinguistics and what psycholinguists study, the connection between it. So thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Goodbye.